Welcome back to episode 3 of WNBA Retrospect, a historical WNBA scouting series. Today we'll discuss Ticha Penicheiro, one of the WNBA's greatest passers ever and a 4-time All-Star. But first, if you missed last week's episode, we discussed Margot Didak, the WNBA's all-time block leader and the tallest player in league history at 7'2", out of Poland. Lots of women's basketball starts now.
Ogunbowale for the win.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.
Welcome. You are Locked On Women's Basketball. Thanks for making us your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube. My name is Hunter Cruse, and I'm your Saturday host, covering prospect scouting and women's basketball at large. This episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. I'll be joined by my co-hosts M. Adler and Lincoln Shafer. M covers the WNBA in the New York market with a focus on player development and analysis. Lincoln is an indispensable part of our scouting team here at The Next. You can follow him on Twitter at Dovienia_. But as I said, our conversation today is centered around Old Dominion point guard Ticha Penicheiro. So let's take you back to 1998. During Penicheiro's time at ODU, she was named a 2-time All-American while becoming the CAA's all-time leader in career assists and steals. Penicheiro led the Monarchs to a national title game appearance in her junior season and 3 straight Sweet 16 appearances from 1996 to 1998 before becoming the number 2 overall draft pick in the 1998 WNBA Draft to Sacramento, behind the aforementioned Margot Didak. All right, so there's many directions we can go with this to start, but for you, M, what was your impression from watching Ticha at ODU?
I think the immediate conclusion I had within less than a quarter of watching Ticha was that this was the greatest passer of all time. I'm not sure it's particularly close, and also probably the worst finisher I think I've ever scouted. And this is including some mid-major people that I've tried to look into over the past couple of years. It's not close.
The scoring is very interesting to see someone who played with the ball in her hands so much and was a wizard seeing the court. Just the inability to finish plays and put the ball in the basket is a little bit wild to see.
And the interesting thing is you can see that she was a very capable, in terms of the process of scoring, it on all ends of the court, offense, defense, in the middle, whatever, on off the ball. Well, other than off the ball on defense where there were some problems. Other than that, she has one of the best floor games in just general basketball IQs I think I've ever seen in the game.
For sure.
And that's on top of the quality of just the raw passing quality she had. It's just wild to see how unbelievable that package was, and that being combined with sort of your poison pills of the complete inability to finish, and also the really pronounced tendency to give up a hell of a lot of back cuts on defense. It's like the 2 biggest poison pills you can have for being great at everything else.
Yeah. One of the things that I noticed is that a lot of her layups and rim attempts were coming from outside the restricted area. She's picking up the ball and kind of making an out of control leap. It felt like she was picking the ball up a half step early. You could have taken maybe one more dribble and gotten closer into the rim, but just couldn't get all the way into the rim. And I think part of that could be a 19, 20-year-old having a little bit of lack of faith in her handle going into the trees down low and being more comfortable passing the ball than scoring the ball. But that tendency to pick the ball up like a half dribble early is something that I think really hampered her scoring inside the lane, especially.
And at ODU, she averaged upwards of 4.5 to 5 steals per game. So she was even having a lot of transition opportunities, and she was blowing those too at the rim, it was really interesting to watch some of just her offensive processing in general, because she would get good looks, and she just wouldn't finish the plays. Like, I thought she had some really impressive reads. Just the passing in general, like you guys said, was out of this world. Outside of that, I thought she was a little bit passive. Like, they were giving her jumpers too, and she just wasn't shooting them.
Mhm.
There's moments like that.
Which I mean, like, if you your game and you know you basically should never be taking a jump shot, like that's one thing.
She also had an incredible team built around her. Like her junior season that they went to the national championship game with Mary Andretti, Nairi Roberts, and Clarice Machangwana, who all played multiple years in the WNBA, who all scored double digits that year. 2 of them over 17 points per game. When you know you have that kind of scoring in the post, it kind of makes sense to become a little passive. And like, we're being critical because this is us trying to figure out who the greatest prospects of all time are. But she's still like an all-time great college basketball player. She was an All-American multiple times. She had a 4-year record of 117 and 14 at Old Dominion. And
at least a 1 or 2 time CAA Player of the Year.
Yeah, 2-time CAA Player of the Year and the CAA Rookie of the Year as a freshman. Was second in ODU history in assists and first in steals. Like, this is one of the best guards to play college basketball ever. And it's the scoring is like a big flaw in her game, but that didn't stop her from being one of the most effective basketball players in the country for 4 years at Old Dominion.
And even then, it's not just the quality of the overall production for college she's putting up, but it's the passing that you see that is the kind of stuff that is just things that you don't actually see from pros at any level, men's or women's. The ability to read the court, to set up defenders, and sort of know where the passing lane is going to be, and have the confidence to say that you can put the ball there, and the lane is still going to stay open there, or will open up to where you're passing it to by the time the ball gets through. That's, like I said, super high level, professional level. Even at that point, that was that. I don't think there should have ever been any question about whether that was going to translate. And I think on the defensive end, it's certainly interesting. Trying to get a read on that. Certainly, her ability to harass people on the ball was, I think, extraordinarily obvious. And her ability to pick pockets when people weren't paying attention, like even the slightest, was, super impressive. There were some parts of it, like I mentioned before, that maybe were a little concerning in terms of how much do you think they can or will translate. She didn't have a huge number of reps on the ball unless ODU felt like it was an emergency and they had to switch her on to the opponent's top winger guard scorer. And so even with that, when you're a guard and you're providing so much and such aggressive off-ball help, it's a little concerning. You can see against Tennessee in the 97 Natty, she gives up a bunch of back cuts to, even players like Jimmy Coldsclaw. There should be basically no reason you're ever not facing up to her off the ball in denial. And that's super over aggressive. And that's the kind of thing that it's both a physical inclination towards helping on the ball, and it's also a psychological inclination. And the combination makes it very hard to fix, at least when you're evaluating a prospect.
Yeah, let's go to a break and we'll talk about just our scouting grade, where we fall on her, on our scouting scale, 2080 scale. The WNBA season is in full swing, so PrizePicks is your number one spot for daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than your PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 25 times your earning on any entry. No competing against other people. It's just you versus the projection. PrizePicks offers projections on any sport you can watch, whether that's the WNBA, MLS, MLB, esports, boxing, cricket, and more. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. Welcome back. I'm your host, Hunter Cruse, and thanks for joining us. Let's get into our scouting grades on Ticha, solely based on the film we watched from her time at Old Dominion, taking into account just how the league was running at the time, rather than taking current scouting philosophies and ideas that we'll see with current team building. But first, for those unfamiliar, we use a baseball-like 2080 scale to rank players. A 40 grade, basically an average WNBA contributor, and going up from there, 45 is the top end backup, 50 is your average starter, 55 is above average starter, 60 is an all-star caliber player, 70 is all WNBA caliber player, and finally 80 is reserved for like your MVP candidates, your first team all WNBA players at that level. But going to you first, Lincoln, where did you fall on Ticha's game?
Yeah, for me, another flawed player who has obvious areas that she brings a ton of value to. She is, like Em said earlier, she's an out of this world passer of the basketball. The thing that stood out to me the most is like her misdirection, using head fakes, hand fakes, throwing the ball where the defense and her both aren't looking. But to me, the scoring is a problem. And I think I'd end up somewhere in the range of like a 45 or a 50. I'm in between those two a little bit. That's kind of where I'm leaning, because she's so obviously bringing a ton of value in certain areas and so obviously limited in other areas that are holding her back from reaching like an MVP or all league level of player.
Yeah, I ended up in a similar spot. I was sort of going back and forth in the general range of 45, 50, 55. I ended up just sort of cutting the baby in half at 50. There's a lot of it to me really does rely upon the period you're in, because there were basically two players camping out the paint on almost every team for basically the decade she entered the league and the decade starting in the years she entered the league. So it's a lot less of a liability if someone can't score essentially at all. And the main thing then really in just the variability in the grade, she's going to be someone who can set up your posts, and so it's variable around what your post can do. Great transition player, but there's a little less reliance on the transition back then. So there's a little bit of variance based on the scheme of the team she's going to. But I think for me, most of the variability came in terms of whether or not her actual on-ball defense that she would have to use to make up more value with in the W was going to be, because she's going to be used so little on the ball. Her career averages in the W for her career, I believe she ended up being a 35% assist rate, which in basically every year is number one in the league, and 15% in usage rate, which for reference, assuming that in a basketball play, the ball is used 100% of the time, an average player is 20%. So she was essentially leading the league in assist rate every year while also being sixth or seventh most used on her team to finish a possession, which is a wild combination. So to actually make up that sort of value on a play-by-play, regular starter basis has come on defense. And, there were flashes of excellent on-ball defense, not enough to say for me to be confident in being an elite point of attack defender, but enough to just sort of trust the talent and run with it. So I ended up with a 50, which, average starter on a good team.
Yeah, I ended up between 45 and 50 like Lincoln. With her defense, though, I was intrigued by the off-ball stuff more than anything. She had really quick hands. As you can expect, her hands are really good just with passing and being able to use her hands well on defense. ODU did run a zone a little bit, so I feel like her steals were inflated. Like she averaged 5 steals, which is crazy. But I thought in general, I was impressed with her defense. I thought she would be an above-average defender just from what I watched in college. She moved well. I thought I was impressed by that end of the floor. Then on offense, like you said, the liability probably wasn't as big of a deal for teams at the time. Mm-hmm. Like you couldn't really scheme as well against it. Like teams just didn't really have the ability to play her off the court. And I mean, she did play off the court a little bit, but I'm just saying in terms of when she was entering the league in her prime, from a WNBA regular season standpoint, I thought she had a lot of value to teams, just the passing ability, defensive playmaking as well. That combination.
And that's the same thing we said with Marco Didek as well.
Yes.
Being a regular season, being a regular season innings eater at defensive post, but how much of an issue does that become in the playoffs? The interesting thing, I think, just on that point, in Sacramento, it was a good team, obviously. They won a title. Must have been a pretty good team. They had a lot of redundancy on the roster. They were starting two pretty similar posts in Yo and Rebecca Brunson, and they were basically starting Ticha, the point guard, and Kara Lawson, who was an excellent shooting combo guard at that point. And so you had a little bit of redundancy in the backcourt. What's interesting is in terms of thinking about how you want to play them together or stagger them. In terms of the playoffs, Ticha was drafted in 98. Kara was drafted in 2003. So they played together in Sacramento for 5 years, and they made the playoffs in all those years. Across those 5 years, they played together while Kara was still on a rookie deal for 4 years. That's how long a rookie deal is. And they made the playoffs all 4 of those years. Across all those years, Kara averaged more minutes in the playoffs than Ticha, which I think is decently telling of how the team themselves thought of their respective values.
You also mentioned the 15% usage was actually 11th on that 2005 Monarchs team, not 6th or 7th. It was 11th on that Monarchs team. Yep. But that idea that her skill set is great for regular season and a little less useful when you're getting into like playoff basketball is something that we've seen before then and since then in men's and women's basketball. It's something that, like, it's a very important player, but she's never going to be the first or second best player on a championship team. And those scoring limitations are like the number one reason for that. And that's one of the things that held me back from going up higher in the draft grade.
Yeah, and she was basically either the 4th or 5th best player on the Monarchs championship team, depending on how much value you put in Nicole Powell's scoring. I mean, just to put Ticha's scoring in perspective, the average field goal percentage at the rim in the WNBA in today's day and age, in today's day and age is usually in the high 50s, or it's around 60% for a player, even a guard. Ticha, for her Monarchs career in Sacramento, she hit 47% of her shots at the rim, which includes wide open layups and post-ups against literal 5'4" guards. For her entire WNBA career, she hit less than a third of all of her non-rim paint twos, which
isn't very good.
It's about 10 percentage points under the median WNBA score. Like, I want to be clear. She was here's the thing. The one thing we haven't mentioned as well, like, her handle was ridiculous. Like, I think the first couple of times the clips I saw at ODU, I was like, all right, she's got like a good handle, but it wasn't the smoothest thing in those clips. And then I watched 2 more minutes and I was like, oh, she can make everyone dizzy. Like, she is in every way the sauciest player in WNBA history. She kind of needed to be to prove that, because otherwise you'd notice the pasta was uncooked. But every part of watching her is incredibly fun.
Yeah, an incredibly fun player and an incredibly saucy player who was she was putting on a show. And it was a ton of fun to watch her play basketball.
Basketball is about entertainment. And when you have a player like that, as long as you have a center who can mop it up with the putbacks.
Let's go to one final break, but after, I want to talk about just the intersection of the highlight part of things, being an exciting player, then also her actual value, which we see and how she's talked about now. There's a little bit of an overlap there to where it makes things hard for people that didn't watch back then to understand how good she was and compared to her numbers actually were. Buying tickets to your favorite sporting events shouldn't be stressful. With the Game Time app, it's easy to find and buy tickets for any kind of event in your area. Game Time is a place for your last-minute ticket deals with exclusive flash offers on tickets for basketball, baseball, soccer, concerts, theater, and more. Snag the tickets you want without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create your account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off on your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the Game Time app. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, we're back. I want to preface this by saying Ticha is she was a good player, really good player, like we've said.
Really good player, even better agent.
Right. But also the question I want to ask is she somewhat a product of highlight culture? Because whenever you watch her film, you see the moments, you see the flashy moments, you see the highlight plays that obviously if you look back now, you'll see just the highlight plays on Twitter or whatever it is. And you're like, oh yeah, this player was great. But if you look at her resume from a statistical standpoint, and you also compare that to actually how much value she had to her team, like you said, she wasn't one of the best players on a championship team. But she, in reality, if you look at where she's ranked all time, even by the official media members that made that WNBA 25 team, she was the best player on that team according to them, right? First or second best player on that team according to them, basically. So that's the tricky part. It's like, then she probably wasn't the best player. But looking back now, why is she considered one of the best players on that team? And obviously that's where the value comes from being that's the number one thing on her resume. She was a one-time WNBA champion, and she brought that championship to Sacramento.
And a four-time All-Star, which I don't want to overlook. And when we are looking at who she played with, Rebecca Brunson is a basketball Hall of Famer. Yolanda Griffith won an MVP and is a basketball Hall of Famer. Kara Lawson, I think, is where you get into an interesting inflection point, because Kara Lawson is a one-time All-Star. Kara Lawson was considered. I think there are clear indicators that Kara Lawson was considered at least as good of a player by the team that managed both her and Ticha. Kara Lawson also deserved to be a first-team All-WNBA player for multiple years when she got to a system that allowed her to be a scoring focal point in Connecticut. She also was the best player on a team in which a teammate won the MVP award in 2012. Like, do we think that how you disentangle value and greatness from teams that are so stacked with talent is, I mean, first of all, it's a huge problem with the early years of the WNBA, especially because not only do you have such a dense amount of talent, but you still have a dense amount of talent now, but specifically then, it was so much less even in terms of its distribution, in that, you had, even in the later years of Ticha's career, when she goes to LA for a couple of years, she's finally a decently efficient scorer. And the real thing there was, instead of having, this two post-oriented system where you had just like two outside shooters in the way she had like with the Kara and with Nicole Powell in Sacramento, when she's in LA, she's playing with Delisha Milton-Jones, Delisha Milton-Jones, Tina Thompson, Candace Parker. And those are basically three of the best front court scorers in the entire league in that point, but just in terms of versatility and the way that they were able to play off each other both on and off the ball. And it meant that for Ticha, there was a lot more versatility in the offense and a lot more ability just to be able to use these players' ability to toggle to play off each other. And she was actually able to be an effective picking her spots as a game manager. But this is the point in terms of trying to disentangle value. You have so much value stacked up on that team that allows her skill set to play up. You compare it to when that team would play against the Tulsa Shock, who had nothing going for them in those years. Nothing at all. And it's just such a wide gap that you end up having this thing where some players are going to have incredibly favorable circumstances to play in, some not so much.
You bring up a point there that the ecosystem of the WNBA in the early 2000s, there's still only one basketball, and I'd argue that on those early Monarchs teams, it's more important.
Now we have three.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but it's important to have someone like Ticha in there to get Nicole Powell and Yolanda Griffith and Rebecca Brunson the ball for 9 to 10 shots a game, and she never took more than like 6 shots a game.
Mm-hmm.
So having that kind of an unselfish point guard who's willing to sacrifice shots to get the ball to teammates is something that's really important, especially for a team with that much talent in the front court.
And I would add that's especially important because there was so much, because the average gap, or the gap between the passing ability of your average point guard and everyone else has significantly closed time. So it was even more important that your point guard be a great passing distributor over everything, over every other skill in that point.
Yes. And like her feel and her vision were well ahead of most basketball players today, and which is orders of magnitude ahead of your average basketball player in 1998 when she entered the league. So to have that kind of a basis of an offense with Ticha throwing the ball to Yolanda Griffith in her prime is going to set the Monarchs up for success offensively, even if Ticha's not the one that's putting the ball in the hoop at a high rate or an efficient rate.
Which I think makes it particularly interesting from a schematic standpoint when you have that value, like we were just talking about, because as Hunter said, in terms of being a regular season high-level play, she really raised the floor of an offense. And as you were just saying, because of being able to feed the better players and the great scores, it also kind of raises the ceiling of an offense even in the playoffs. But once you hit a team like Seattle, if you hit a team like Phoenix, for those days, really more Phoenix so than Seattle, but these kinds of teams who are able to attack with all five people, and these teams who are able to use the floor, use more. None of the teams were using the floor as much as we use the floor today, even Phoenix, but teams who were able to use a lot more of it than Sacramento was doing for themselves. It makes it interesting in that when you're playing Ticha 26, 27 minutes a game in the playoffs, you've raised both your floor and your ceiling, but you've also sort of capped your limit as well. And I think it's an interesting game to play in terms of trying to find the sweet spot of trying to win a championship. And hey, if it works once, it works enough.
Winning a championship is not easy to do. So to even accomplish it once, that's a great success.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think most of the players that I would sort of compare to this archetype would have won a championship, just in general.
Right, I would agree with that.
Speaking of archetype, let's get to some player counts for these players.
Segues.
Take it away with these player comps.
I had one. It's Lincoln and I thought of the same one, but I'll give it to him. The one that came to mind was just like a tall Rui Machida. You have someone who is you have someone who is an excellent, insanely flashy passer. Ticha was significantly less turnover prone than Rui Machida, but complete liability in terms of putting the ball in the hoop. One of them played in a very spacey offense and offensive environment in which every defender can be targeted and every offensive player needs to threaten in some way, shape, or form. So she was just a complete disaster in like the 2 minutes she played in the playoffs. And she was kind of a disaster in the regular season too, because you can't do that anymore.
But really was also
a really interesting pest defensively.
He was also the smallest player on the court at all times, which wasn't the case for Ticha.
Mm-hmm. No. Ticha was fully capable of guarding up one or two positions.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Which again is one of the reasons why even in this archetype she was able to be such a valuable player.
Absolutely.
even for teams like her two super good offensive years when she was with the Sparks. Her defense, her length and size on defense, and her ridiculous intelligence in terms of hitting rotations and switches allowed her to make up for the fact that you have two super long and rangy forwards playing the 3 and 4 in Felicia Jones and Tina Thompson, both of whom are also quite poor defenders for the position.
Yeah, to me, the closest stylistic comp is someone who actually the closest career as a professional basketball player comparison is someone who retired right when Ticha was starting her professional career, and that's Nate McMillan, who you may know better as the former Hawks basketball coach. He was a 2-time all-defense player, had multiple seasons over 8 assists per game, and never scored more than 7.5 points per game. And all of that I saw, and I was like, this is an incredibly similar career to what Ticha did, but without the all-star appearances, but with making an all-defense team, because he played 12 years with the Seattle Supersonics between 1986 and 1999, and made 2 all-defense teams. Led the league in steals a season, and averaged 8+ assists a game for the first 4 years of his career. And that career comparison to me is the closest. But I know that M was thinking of Jason Williams, White Chocolate, who entered Sacramento at the same time as her.
Duke.
One of the better passers in the history of basketball in terms of making those flashy passes. And another comparison along those same lines would be like young Rajon Rondo with like the title-winning Celtics teams, who was playing elite defense, was making flashy passes, and was setting up his more talented teammates to score the ball. So that's my 3 sicko comparisons there: Nate McMillan, Jason Williams, and young Rajon Rondo.
It's not bad.
I think the comps that we were both using, I think, highlight how useful this archetype was back then, and as we spent several minutes mentioning, and sort of how much harder it is to find a real spot for it today. And I think it's particularly interesting that it's not that Ticha and the player picked right before her at number 1, Margot Didek, in the '98 draft. The players we've done the past couple of weeks have both been players who were real standouts for their time and probably couldn't play in the playoffs these days, or at least play more than like 8 minutes in the playoffs at the very maximum end. After we passed Tina Thompson, who lasted, I think, 15 years in the league. I actually have this written down. Tina Thompson, who lasted 17 years in the league, retired as its all-time leading scorer, I believe. And she did it with a whole bunch of teams that played a lot more modern than most teams for that age. You had you had 6 very successful runs with the Sparks and the Storm, even at her time. And it's interesting to me that we've started off this series with a player who would hold up in any era, and then 2 players who would only hold up in their own eras.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like we said with Margot, her skill set now is like a 30. So it's like a replacement level player. But then she's closer to a 55, 50 range. And then with someone like Ticha, we're talking about someone like you said, who's closer to a 45, 50. But if she was playing in the modern game, having a player that's this offensive limited, what are we saying, 30 to maybe 40, like at the most, if you have the right context for?
It would be a really soft 40.
Like the closest modern comparison would be Nika Mule at UConn, who is a really good passer and defender.
Who's at least in the league.
That works too. Yeah, but Nika Mule, it's a comparison.
38-year-old Ticha Penicheiro who played at UConn,
who is like the same college archetype of like a game manager, a defender, and a very good passer who struggles to score the ball. And we had her as a 40 future value on our board a couple months ago.
The interesting thing there is, like we said, the issue is the scoring and the just the ability to put the ball in the hoop, even when the openings present themselves with Ticha. Like Nika's college finishing and even just her college short range jumper is
right.
I've looked at the numbers; it's miles ahead of where Ticha was at any point prior to her stint with the Sparks. And that's what makes her like a more solid, if not like great, but like a solid prospect in terms of like we're not super concerned about the ability of her to like literally just do things when she has to, or else she can't play. But by the same token, I think it's a little short to call Ticha just a game manager in that sense, where Nika Mule is obviously a very good passer. Like again, Ticha is I think we'd all agree the greatest playmaker of all time. She was setting teammates up even when defenses were trying to ignore Ticha as a scorer.
Yeah. Completely fair.
Thanks for making Left Women's Basketball your first listen every day. On Tuesday, Howard will be back for a conversation with Minnesota Lynx guard Lindsey Allen. And next Saturday, you can join us again as we continue our historical scouting series that you won't find anywhere else outside of Locked Women's Basketball and our team at the Next. Have a great weekend, everyone.